Hello again. I'm David Wilkins, and welcome to the fourth class in our series on American slavery. Let me share my screen and get the slides up, and we'll get started. Last week, we were really just getting into the Revolutionary War and some of the issues surrounding, and we'll continue, obviously, with that in this fourth class. Quick summary. We discussed Ira Berlin's formulation of the three generations, the charter generation, those original Africans that were brought to the New World, the plantation generation, so the generations after the initial contact, the plantation system obviously being the source of all the great wealth that would come from the trade in human beings. And then today we're going to talk about the revolutionary generation. These are the constructions of Ira Berlin as he talks about American slavery. We looked at Bacon's Rebellion as a particularly important event, which essentially led the European colonists to realize that Africans would be their labor source for the future. And you see from this attempt at essentially a rebellion of poor whites and poor blacks, the wealthy landowners realize we need to align ourselves with the poor whites against the blacks. And you see then for the first time the use of the term white. We're no longer English or Spanish, but we are white, and the Africans are black. And then you see the institution of a series of slave codes, which would ultimately result in Africans being slaves for life and the children of African women being born enslaved. We looked at uh, Spanish Florida, remembering that Spain would control Florida for much of the 18th century. And in fact, it would be a refuge for runaway enslaved people if they could get to Florida. And we looked at Fort Mose as an example of a encampment built and managed by enslaved Africans in north of or outside of St. Augustine. We considered the Stono Rebellion. As we've said, enslaved people resisted in a myriad ways, violently, as in the instance of Stono. And this was a event where enslaved Africans were trying to make it to Charleston, South Carolina, believing that they could make it to Florida and then to freedom. And now we're going to look at the revolutionary generation and the questions of freedom and bondage. And let's get into that. We did see this video last week. We won't show it again today. We began to talk about this issue of liberty and freedom from the perspective of the colonist patriots and from the perspective of the enslaved. Historians asked the question, was the Declaration of Independence, uh, July 4th, 1776, a declaration of independence or indeed a declaration of secession? Much like the secession documents that we'll study as we get into the Civil War, the Confederate States issued secession statements that they were leaving the Union, entitled to leave the Union. And their motivation, obviously, was it was in their best interest to continue to be able to enslave other people. The question that we pose today is whether there was a similar motivation on behalf of the so-called patriots as they made their case against the king, against English tyranny, as they characterized it. And again, the question is, was this a demand for freedom and liberty from tyranny, or was this a demand to be able to continue operating free of the constraints that they believed might be imposed on them? And I'm referring, obviously, the constraint to end slavery, abolish slavery, to destroy the system of unpaid labor that had supported the colony and would continue to support the new United States after the Revolutionary War. So it's a question that we're going to continue to examine throughout the class today for sure. I began talking a bit about the emergence of African leaders, particularly in the church. I talked about three gentlemen in particular who would be central to the formation of the church, and that formation is a reflection of the emerging Black community. The Black family and the church would be the earliest institution and the most important institution in the Black community, both enslaved and free, throughout the 18th, 19th, and arguably still today. And it has its roots in this era of independence and demands for freedom. Declarations of independence came from enslaved people as well as from the wealthy landowning colonists. There were petitions made just as the petitions were being debated in the halls of the various colonial governments. They were receiving, particularly in Massachusetts and Boston petitions from enslaved Africans. An example, this is a petition, January 13th, 1777. The petition of a great number of Blacks, it begins, detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country, humbly showeth that your petitioners, again, these are people of African descent, enslaved, making a petition to the government. Your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe verse that bestowed equally on all mankind and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever, but that were unjustly dragged by the hand of cruel power and their dearest friends, and some of them even torn from the embraces of their tender parents, from a populous, pleasant, and plentiful country, and in violation of laws of nature and of nations, and in defiance of all the tender feelings of humanity, brought here either to be sold like beasts of burden, and like them condemned to slavery for life, among a people professing the mild religion of Jesus, a people not insensible to the secrets of rational being, nor without spirit. You see a theme that would match again the arguments that the colonial patriots would be making to the crown and to the government and British, a reference to natural law, to the right of unalienable freedom. And this is but one of the several petitions you would see being made. None of these petitions would result in even a reply from the colonial governments, either in Massachusetts or in Virginia. These would be more likely to be seen in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, not in the Chesapeake Bay area in Virginia and Maryland, and certainly not farther south. Phillis Wheatley, I mentioned a very, very interesting story last week. She would be purchased at the age of 7 by the Wheatleys, a family who had recently lost a girl child, and they would raise her in their home as their lost daughter. As Phillis would say, never looked on as a slave. So by age 12, she was able to read Latin, Greek, the Greek classics, and English literature and the Bible. She published her first poem in 1767, and by 1771, her parents realize she has a gift, and that in order for that gift to be recognized, they impanel a group of the best Boston citizens who interrogate her. They look at her, obviously her portfolio of work, and they make the conclusion after this rigorous examination We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following page were, as we verily believe, written by Phyllis, a young Negro girl who was but a few years since brought, an uncultivated barbarian, from Africa. What's fascinating about Phyllis, in addition to being the first person of African descent published, she must travel to Europe to have her first book published. And there are in that book of poems and essays, several that speak again to the spirit of independence and demands against tyranny. She's essentially making the case on behalf of the European colonialists for freedom, and I think her biographer would say a veiled argument for freedom for her own people. Crispus Attucks is a fascinating character. I think I've got a photo of him here in maybe the next slide. He was a runaway and was working on the docks in Boston at the time that the tensions between the colonials and the British, who were serving as soldiers, were at their height. The tension was really driven by this practice of impressment, where the British soldiers would essentially be imposed on the colonials. They would be housed with people without their permit, and people like Attucks could be pressed into service on behalf of the crown and forced to work at the behest and without pay for the British. There is a argument that um, occurs in a pub where Attucks, again an African, a runaway, his biographers believe, leads this tussle essentially with the British soldiers. They this is the fight is moved out to the green where the regulars come, and there's a confrontation, and Attucks is killed. Quite ironically, again, a runaway of African descent, and he will go down in our history as the first to defy, the first to die. And this is a rather famous uh, artist rendition of that, and again, one of the sparks that would lead to the ultimate war. Also, interestingly, John Adams, who will become obviously a very well-known founder, leader of the revolutionary movement, would, as a lawyer, represent the British soldiers. And he will make a case and include references to Attucks. Adams he would fiercely advocate the Declaration of Independence, yet in his speeches and writing, he was also a crown lawyer, and in his defense of the soldiers, in referring to Attucks, he says, "This Attucks appears to have undertaken to be the hero of the night, and to lead this army with banners, to form them in the first place in Dock Square and march them up to King Street with their clubs. This man with his party cried, 'Do not be afraid of them. They have the reinforcements coming down under the command of a stout mulatto fellow,' as Adams refers to him. And Adams says, whose looks were enough to terrify any person, and would what had not the soldiers then to fear. He had a hardiness enough to fall in upon them, and with one hand took hold of a bayonet, and with the other knocked the man down." So Adams spoke for the elite who feared the revolutionary activism of blacks and poor whites. Again, we see this theme, this anxiety among the wealthy planter, the upper class, essentially, that there could be a coalition of poor whites and blacks, and that was to be resisted at all cost. Okay, so we then get into again, as I said, we're not going to be looking at the Revolutionary War as a study of the actual conflict. Many of you know that from your high school or college courses. What I'm examining are the motivations underlying that battle, and asking the questions: was this a fight for democracy, or a fight to control property, both real and human? Let's take a listen to, again, one of my favorite now past historians on the issue of the war.
The American Revolution actually puts in sharp relief the difference between America's ideals and rhetoric and America's practice. I mean, here we have a nation coming into existence saying to the world that the reason that we are about to embark on a revolution, on a break with Great Britain, is because we believe in human freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and on about liberty and justice and equality. And those same people making this plea to the world are also the holders of human beings in bondage. And so to talk about God-given rights that you are now denying to your fellow human beings sets up a particularly difficult contradiction, the great American contradiction between Americans' ideals and America's action. Now, that does have a great impact on some places and some people in this new emerging nation. In places in the North where there is slavery, but the numbers of slaves are relatively small compared to the South, and the economic importance of slavery is less compared to the South. In those places, there are movements to abolish slavery. And in some of these northern states, slavery is abolished immediately by constitution. For example, we know that in 1777, Vermont writes a constitution in which slavery is abolished. And in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 abolishes slavery, but it doesn't really take effect until after a slave sues in the court system of Massachusetts. And then in 1783, the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts declares slavery abolished in the state. But either through these immediate constitutional measures or through gradual emancipation processes in places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York, slavery is disappearing from the North. At the same time, in the South, slavery is not disappearing. But what that means is that the revolution and its rhetoric is having an effect in the North, which is making it more difficult for those states to justify slavery. Then at the same time, you get, during the revolution, the British offering freedom to slaves who will come to the British lines and support the British cause. And they do by the tens of thousands. You know, Thomas Jefferson estimates that in Virginia alone, 30,000 slaves walk off the plantation to find sanctuary with the British. There are also some slaves who are freed because of the fact that the American cause needs supporters, needs soldiers. And some slaves that fight in the American Revolution on the side of the Americans receive their freedom. So that all in all, with the numbers of slaves who run away, the numbers of slaves who are freed because of measures that are being put into place in northern states abolishing the institution, the number of slaves who are freed because they are fighting for the American cause, all in all, we find tens of thousands of slaves who are freed as a result of the American Revolution. In fact, there are more slaves freed in the aftermath of the American Revolution than in any other single event until we come to the Civil War in the mid-19th century.
So many interesting questions that are raised. We've often talked about the Civil War and its motivating, driving factors, but in my reading, as I study this subject more carefully, there's some Very, very interesting questions that I frankly never thought about as a college history major. This new scholarship is that Woody Holton is another of these new scholars, and he contrasts resistance to British tyranny with resistance to British meddling. And what he considers the fact that the revolutionaries in our experience are the upper class, the wealthy planters, as opposed to revolutions in other parts of the world at other times that are usually bottom up. And so, what motivates these wealthy planter aristocrats to revolt? And Holton says it's frankly the meddling, and that meddling is seen in two or three specific ways. Uh, there is a royal proclamation in 1763, so decade before or two before the actual revolution, but the crown, the king says to the colonist, because we've just completed this French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, we're broke. We can't continue to fund uh, your expansion west of the Appalachians, leave the indigenous people alone, and that thwarts the economic plans of wealthy planters like Washington and Jefferson, who are land speculators as well as politicians and wealthy planters. So this royal proclamation is a real economic threat to them. They have plans to buy as much land as they can, and the crown has stopped. So this has caused a rift. The Revolutionary era, so the 1700s, tensions add to that, and the fact that the enslaved people are engaging in these debates, they actually reach out to Lord Dunmore, who is the Governor General, the Crown's representative, and suggest that they will support uh, the king and his interest in the colonies if they can be assured their freedom. Lord Dunmore doesn't accept that initial approach, but he will ultimately in 1775. In 1774, he actually forms a Ethiopian regiment. So some several hundred formerly enslaved and free people of color who are prepared to stand against the patriots in behalf of the crown in exchange for freedom. We'll get to Lord Dunmore's proclamation of emancipation in a bit. So it's just these interesting questions. Was this really a war for freedom and independence and liberty? And if it was, who was that for? I think we all know it was not for women. It was not for indigenous Indian peoples. It certainly was not for enslaved Africans, who would made up most of the population of the colonies at the time. Lord Dunmore's proclamation, as I said, at the war is now begun, and the enslaved people again approach Lord Dunmore, and he does in fact issue a proclamation, essentially saying if any enslaved people can make their way to the British lines and support the British cause, they will be granted their liberty. And we will see how that is played out at the end of the war. So this question will continue to be asked, what exactly causes the war? Was slavery a factor in the war? Let me go back here and pick up. Okay, so was slavery a major cause of this battle? There was a case in the courts in London, the Somerset decision, where a enslaved African accompanies his enslaver on a business trip to the UK, meets British abolitionists, and they encourage him to hire a lawyer who has been making these cases, and the case ends up in the court in London, and the judge rules that there is no ground, no basis in British or English law to keep a person enslaved. Therefore, this individual is free. Well, this causes a stir along with the other concerns in the relationship between the crown and the colonies. Now there is this risk that indeed the English law might extend to the colonies, and the enslavers in the colonies would lose their right in property in man. And so this, along with the other great concerns, will continue to cause tensions. There are a number of slave revolts in and around. We've talked about Stono, but there were a number of revolts in Jamaica, in Bermuda, in Dutch Guyana, the British Honduras, all through this period of time. And so you have the concern, several concerns by the colonists in what would become the United States, the ever-present fear of slave insurrection, threats or fears that the English law would abolish slavery in the colonies. And again, the enslaved themselves demanding their freedom, both in formal petition, but also going in around to the British authorities and offering support in exchange for their freedom. So there are a number of reasons that support the case that this war for independence was as much a war for the self-interest of the wealthy planters and leaders of the colonies to protect their investment, both in the expanding land that they were trying to acquire, as well as increasing the number of enslaved people to help make that land profitable. Okay, let's keep moving here. All right, so Berlin, as I said, is the his model is the model that I find most helpful in understanding how slavery is different in different parts of the colonies, the future United States, at different periods of time. He talks about the revolutionary model in the North. Professor Horton talked about how ultimately slavery would gradually be eliminated, both through constitutional changes and court decisions, like in Massachusetts. And you see again Black leadership in the church emerging, and these are small groups of free people of color in the Northeast, and again petitioning in Massachusetts, in New York, in New Jersey for their freedom. In the Upper South, the Chesapeake Bay area, slavery is expanding. Tobacco has become even more valuable, and you see large numbers of enslaved people gaining their freedom as a result of the revolution. And Lord Dunsmore's proclamation would result in thousands, and the estimate was 30,000 from Virginia alone. By this time, we see a natural increase in enslaved populations in the Mid-South and the Lower South. So these are second, third generation enslaved people who are having children, either consensually or by rape. And this will be a dynamic that we will see magnified greatly throughout the 19th century. In the Lower South, Berlin describes the Civil War as the most bitter of battles, because this is the area, again, where there's less control, less government, large numbers of enslaved people being brought in as the poor farmers, and burgeoning so grape planters are trying to expand their plantation operations. And you see a fierce battle being fought. The British would take 20,000 blacks into the lower South. And again, there's the fighting both on plantations in the battles is horrendous, and thousands of lives are lost. And at the same time, in the lower South, you'll see the international slave trade will continue to funnel thousands of Africans into, again, this fast-growing part um, of the colonies. Um, at the same time, you see a philosophy emerging in the lower South, in the lower Mississippi Valley, where uh, the politicians, the leaders, start to make the case that slavery is a positive good, that this is a blessing that Europeans are imparting to the barbarians, and that indeed what they're doing by enslaving these Africans is a good. And this is a theme that will reach its crescendo during the Civil War and after, as the white power structure will seek to continue its control over Black bodies for the purposes of their economic benefit. Okay, so let's move a famous photo, or a painting, I should say, by Lutz, a German artist who's capturing George Washington's crossing of the Delaware. It's relevant here because, as we've said last time, Washington, who was initially resistant to the concept of Black soldiers, obviously warmed very much to that prospect as his needs for reinforcements grew, and as he saw the good performance of the soldiers, the Black soldiers, assisting in the battle. In this particular case, there is a Black oarsman famously positioned in the front of the boat. His name is Prince Whipple, an enslaved man who was a bodyguard to General Whipple of New Hampshire, one of Washington's aides. When my wife and I lived in Montreal, there was a Canadian public television show. It was called The Book of Negroes. And at the time, I did not know this history, and I was quite surprised by that title. But as you can imagine, I was intrigued. We watched this several segment episode, and it was beautifully done. And it tells the story of the enslaved Americans who indeed followed Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And at the end of the war, once they established their bona fides as having fought for the British through their names being placed in this Book of Negroes, were taken either to Canada. Therefore, we again had our experience in Montreal and met some of the descendants of these formerly enslaved Americans, African Americans, and then they were also taken to the British Caribbean. So interesting story. At the end of the war, the colonials, Washington, wants all formerly enslaved people returned. The British officer put in charge of managing this negotiation, the treaty negotiations, refuses. And he says that it would be a dishonor not to, in fact, honor the commitments that the British have made to the Africans. And so he assigns a group of British soldiers to do a registry of the Africans claiming entitlement to this proclamation promise. And it took several months, but by the end, 3,000 or so formerly enslaved people will join this group, who at the end, they'll depart New York and again go either to Canada or to Caribbean islands where they are given land. And so it's again quite an interesting story at the end of the Revolutionary War. We've talked before about the Maroons and the fact that Maroonage is an outlet that would be seen all across from the north to the mid south to the lower south, as escaped Africans will find their way to the swamps or to the mountains, usually aligning with the indigenous people they find there. Looking for Angola is a site I think I mentioned at the last class, in right here in Bradenton, and I will send a copy of this video clip. We won't take time to watch it now, but it tells the story of Angola, a group of enslaved Africans who escaped from South Carolina into Florida, make their way to the Bradenton River area, and establish a community there for several years, long after the Revolutionary War, and until Andrew Jackson, of the Trail of Tears fame, a slaveholder himself and a rabid pro-American president who will be instrumental in destroying millions of Indian lives as they force the indigenous people to the west. And he will send troops into Florida after the U.S. Takes control of Florida, trying to recapture runaway enslaved people. And this Angola group, many of them will leave the area and go to the Bahamas. So there's an interesting story there too. But again, I will include in our communication to you a short piece on the Maroons in the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary period. It's a good read, short read, but tells the story of some famous Maroons like Juan Malo, who will become a famous fighter, become known as the General of the Swamps. We won't take time to do that here today. Okay, so let's get into talking about the Constitution. And we'll begin with another of James Horton's videos, which I think, again, is excellent.
The American Revolution actually puts in sharp relief the difference between America's ideals and rhetoric and America's practice. I mean, here we have a nation coming into existence saying to the world that
I'm trying to play the video on the Constitution, and this is not it. Here we go. Let's get the right one here.
Between the American Revolution and the Civil War, the Constitution, I think, was very clear in that it protected slaveholders' property. There was a great deal of property protection in the Constitution, and slaves fell under that. In the Constitution, there were protections on the rights of citizens, but it was not clear at all that even free blacks were citizens of the country during this time. And so there was very little specific information in the Constitution that would encourage a free black person to feel that they had any kind of protection through that instrument. You know, many of the abolitionists saw the Constitution as, quote, a slaveholder's document. William Lloyd Garrison burned copies of the Constitution as a kind of protest of the fact that the Constitution was that thing that pro-slavery advocates could call upon to bolster their argument, the thing that constitutional lawyers might use to work in opposition to the anti-slavery movement. One of the things that the Constitution did, you know, was to provide that the federal government had the responsibility to put down uprisings within the state. Well, many of those uprisings might be slave uprisings. And so the constitutional provision that would bring federal troops in to protect slave property within individual slave states, that was something that was very well known to abolitionists and to many free blacks. And the Constitution was viewed with great suspicion and even hostility by many who saw it as a solid protector of the institution of slavery.
So we're going to talk here more about the Constitution and the sections that specifically protected slave holders and slavery. Interestingly, without ever mentioning the word slave or slavery. But I wanted to just quote a couple of passages from an article by Paul Finkelman, who is a University of Chicago historian and Harvard law professor, talking about, again, slavery in the Constitution. And we'll get into the specific provisions. But he says slave owners are all over the Continental Congress, which is adopting it. And so there is this inherent tension from day one between the rights of slave owners to be free and to have liberty, including the liberty to own other people, to buy and sell other people, to whip other people, to treat other people like property, and other Americans who find this to be immoral and appalling and horrible. And that's the tension that comes in with the creation of the United States. So how do we balance slavery and freedom in a nation that on one hand begins with assertions of freedom and rights of liberty, and on the other hand, these assertions are actually being written by slave owners? So a paradox. I think in our first or second session, we talked about this term that one of our historians used to describe this tension that had always existed and would always exist in a society now, specifically having won a war ostensibly to declare its freedom, also now drafting a document to enshrine its entitlement to steal the freedom and labor of other human beings. Again, so an interesting tension that's always going to exist, and will be ultimately the tension that will lead to the Civil War. Finkelman goes on, he says, Northern states began to dismantle slavery. Professor Horton talked about the changes in Massachusetts in law and in the Constitution. Pennsylvania would pass the first piece of legislation in the history of the world to end slavery, 1870, in its Gradual Abolition Act. And it makes, as Professor Horton reminded us, children of enslaved women would be born free. But many of those young people would continue to be enslaved even under Pennsylvania's law until they reached maturity. Eventually, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey would follow. Massachusetts adopts in 1780 its constitution declaring all men are born free and equal. And after 1780, a 1783 court case, in a Massachusetts judge would rule that enslaved slaves can no longer be held in Massachusetts. And New Hampshire had a similar case. So we'll see this again very, very starkly as we start to look at the Constitution in the next section. The delegates from the northern states, where arguably slavery is not as important to the economy, to the wealth creation, as it would be the southern states. So you've got the delegates from two delegates from each of the 13 colonies, and you have this division between those in the north who either personally believe that slavery is abominable and unjustifiable in a country that has just fought a war for liberty. Some of the Northerners who had themselves been enslavers have now agreed that slavery should be abolished. But in the South, you see a growing enslaved population. You see the expansion of slavery. You see an economy becoming more rather than less dependent on more and more enslaved bodies to do the work that needs to be done in the rice fields and then in the cotton fields. And so this is the tension that leads into this constitutional convention in 1787. So let's take a moment here and answer some questions, and then we'll get right back to our lecture. Okay, so as we move into this, and I think I've shared this this quote before. This is Samuel Johnson, a English intellectual and an essayist. Why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Obviously, highlighting the hypocrisy of the colonists, of the new American leaders, who continue to and will continue for many years to hold people in bondage. Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, I'll include that in my mailing to you. There is, again, a racism that is overt, as Jefferson writes quite freely about his observations of the enslaved people on his plantation and on this question of human rights and liberty and freedom and equality. It's instructive to read, again, our third president's views, a leader of the Virginia delegation, perhaps the most influential American at the time after Washington, and his views on the state of Virginia, and frankly, his views on the differences between the people who would call themselves white and people of African descent who are enslaved by them. So let's look at this Constitution specifically, and there are 5 or 6 specific provisions we're going to look at. The first is the 3/5 clause. Familiar, I hope, to most of us, essentially for purposes of representation and direct taxes. The Southern slaveholders demanded that they get property, that they get some power, I should say, in their slaves. Not to give their enslaved people a vote, but just to give them the ability to assert the power that those numbers. And so, the total number of enslaved people you have, you multiply by 3/5. That number then is added for purposes of representation in government and for direct taxes. This is Paul Finkelman's description of that debate. It says the U.S. Constitution was, of course, a complicated document written by a nation in which slavery was legal and prosperous in most of the states. At the convention, slavery is debated throughout the summer of 1787. At the very beginning of the convention, the question is, how do you allocate representation in Congress? And immediately there is a debate between those people who say allocation of representation should be based on the whole number of free people, and those who would like it based on the whole number of people. The difference is critical. Virginia has the largest population if you count the enslaved, and Pennsylvania has the largest if you don't. A matter of political power. Again, James Madison's comment about wanting the power for their slaves. Finkelman continues, we all know, of course, that in the end, the Constitutional Convention adopts something called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause says that representatives and direct taxes will be allocated in the country by counting the whole number of free people, including indentured servants and others who have some sort of servitude but are not slaves, and 3/5 of all other persons. They don't mention Africans, they don't mention slaves, they just all other persons. So the Constitution requires that you count up all the free people and then you count up all the slaves and multiply them by 3/5, and that becomes the basis for representation. And it doesn't stop there. We get to the Electoral College. So whose vote should count in electing the president, Finkelman asked. All free adult males? Madison says our slaves won't count. We won't get any power because of our Negroes. This is Madison again. The end result was that the 3/5 clause is folded into the monstrosity called the Electoral College. Now, why do we have the Electoral College? Not because of states' rights, not because the delegates didn't trust voters. We have the Electoral College because it was the only way they could figure out how to count the numerical power of slaves in a country where slaves, of course, wouldn't vote. And so the electoral votes that every state got was based on the number of the members of the House of Representatives that each state had, and that was based on the 3/5 clause. The implication? The South asserts power beyond its real weight. The election of 1800, Adams would probably have beaten Jefferson. The Missouri Compromise, allowing the 1820 Compromise, allowing the expansion of slavery into the territories, would likely have failed. The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, probably would have failed. The South will continue to dominate national politics because it deftly negotiated this 3/5 clause. Southern power or slave power, Finkelman says. 8 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders or their families who owned slaves. Van Buren, Harrison, and Buchanan. Only the Adamses, Fillmore, and Pierce were not. So again, very, very powerful influence of the southern states and their ability to, and they would not have agreed to the Constitution, and the representatives from New York and Pennsylvania knew that, and Massachusetts, that they were aware of that. The Atlantic slave trade, Article 1, Section 9, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. Notice no reference to Africans, no reference to slaves, just says the importation of such persons. Finkelman says almost everybody agreed the slave trade was horrendously awful and immoral, but Georgia and South Carolina had lost thousands of enslaved during the Revolutionary War. So Georgia and South Carolina insisted upon an explicit, specific protection. What the Constitution is saying is the Migration and Importation Clause, which we refer to as the African Slave Trade Clause, provided that Congress could not end the slave trade until 1808. However, the clause did not require that the slave trade ended in 1808. Sadly, many historians, some political scientists, and legal scholars don't understand this and often write in textbooks that the clause required an end to the slave trade. It did not. It says it cannot be ended before 1808. The Southerners believed that by 1808 their population would be bigger than the North. Luckily, that was not the case. The result, 60,000 Africans brought to the U.S. between 1803 and 1808, the largest importation of enslaved in the country's history. The power of slave trade, of the slave trade provision. Other protections, Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. No Southern, or I should say, the Southern delegates insisted upon a provision allowing the recovery of escapees. No mention of slave, no mention of fugitive. How do you prove the claim that you own someone? In 1793, Congress passes the first fugitive slave law, which has almost no protections for people claimed as fugitive slaves. But it doesn't work very well in part because many Northerners simply don't help Southerners capture runaway slaves. This is from Finkelman again. In 1842, the Supreme Court will hear its first case on the fugitive slave law. It's remarkable that the law is passed in 1793, and there's no case that reaches the Supreme Court before 1842. Case of Prigg versus Pennsylvania says no state can interfere with the return of a fugitive slave, and Congress has the power to pass such legislation. Northern states will pass personal liberty laws in response, and this is another example of increasing tension between the North and South. It will accelerate as we move toward the Civil War, because in 1850, we see a new Fugitive Slave Act. Finkelman says this ultimately would lead to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, the first national law enforcement act in the history of the U.S. It provided for a federal commissioner to be appointed in every county in the U.S. The federal commissioner had the authority to authorize the return of fugitive slaves. The commissioner had the authority to call up the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, or local militias to protect an owner's interest in a fugitive slave, and it led to about 1,000 African Americans being returned to the South between 1850 and 1860. No one knows the actual number, and we do know from cases like Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave, many free people of color were stolen away by slave catchers, claiming that they were indeed slaves. One of the ironies of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 is that it completely violated states' rights. The argument that some Southern historians would give you as the cause of the Civil War violated states' rights because the 1850 law, as well as the Prigg decision in 1842, said that the states had absolutely no power to protect their own citizens from being wrongfully seized as fugitive slaves. And when we think about the debates of the 1850s and the claim that secession is about states' rights, it turns out to be the opposite. The Southern states did not secede to protect states' rights. They seceded because they were fed up with the northern states' rights. They were fed up with the northern states that were trying to protect their citizens, their neighbors, their friends from being seized as fugitive slaves. Two other protections. Article 1, Section 8, right to call a militia, and Article 4, Section 4, the protection against invasion and domestic violence. Finkelman says, here's an interesting thing. Why do we have double protections against insurrections and rebellions? The textbooks all say, well, they're thinking about Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. And certainly they were thinking about Shays' Rebellion. But the Southerners were thinking about slave revolts. We made reference to the numerous slave revolts in the Caribbean. Stono Rebellion. We're going to look at other late or mid 19th century rebellions and revolts and uprisings before the Civil War. Charles Pinckney, the South Carolina delegate to the legislature promoting the adoption, he said the general government can never emancipate them, referring to those held for service, slaves. For no such authority is granted, and it is admitted on all hands that the general government has no power but what was expressly granted by the Constitution, and that all rights not expressed were reserved to the several states. So again, we have this Revolutionary War. We have this proclamation of freedom and liberty by most of the delegates who held men, women, and children of African descent in bondage. We have then the creation of this new government based on its Declaration of Independence and its Constitution, neither of which refers specifically to the Africans, the enslaved, or slavery, but in its most essential purpose confirms the fact that this is a practice that will continue, that is a part of the formation of our government, and it's a contradiction that will continue to plague the new nation up to and even after the Civil War. So let me conclude by just talking about, again, this revolutionary generation. Next session, we're going to start to look at the expansion of slavery in the Mid-South and in the Lower South, the natural increase of enslaved Africans. I said by the time of the Civil War, that 500 or so thousand that come in the first wave from the Atlantic will be 4 million. That's through natural increase. And we'll talk about, begin to talk about the internal slave trade movement of more than 1 million people of African descent from the Mid-South, Virginia and Maryland, to the Lower South, where again, cotton has become king, and many of these large planters have become the wealthiest people in the world. And then we'll look at that dynamic. I want to conclude by talking a bit more about some of the key players here. So Benjamin Banneker, a utterly interesting gentleman. He is I hope you've heard the name, author, scientist, mathematician, farmer, astronomer, publisher, and urban planner. Also descended from African slaves. His mother, Molly Walsh, is an English dairymaid. And once she completes her indenture, she's an indentured servant, she will eventually purchase 2 African slaves. She will marry one in violation of Maryland law, and Benjamin will be the child of that union. Her daughter will also marry an African and take the name of Banneker, and Benjamin will be born, or I should say, Molly's daughter is Benjamin's mother, and he is born in 1731. Banneker grew up in Baltimore, and in a community of about 200 free people of color, among a population of 4,000 enslaved people and 13,000 whites. He learns to read from his grandmother, Molly, and he attends an integrated Quaker school for a time. At the age of 22, Banneker will build a striking clock out of wood using his own drawings and calculations. The clock would continue to run until destroyed by a fire 40 years later. Banneker would become friendly with the Ellicott brothers, who built complex grist mills in the 1770s. And using materials borrowed from the Ellicotts, Banneker nearly accurately predicted the timing of a total eclipse of the sun, only discovering later that his minor error was caused by a discrepancy in this expert's sources, not his calculations. 1791, Banneker would accompany Andrew Ellicott to the banks of the Potomac, where he would assist him in surveying the new federal city that would become Washington, D.C. A notice published in the Georgetown Weekly Ledger and later copied in other newspapers stated that Ellicott was attended by Benjamin Banneker, an Ethiopian, whose abilities as a surveyor and an astronomer clearly proved that Mr. Jefferson's concluding that race of men were void of mental endowments was without foundation. 1792, Banneker will publish an almanac, which he'll send to Jefferson. And between 1792 and 1797, Banneker will publish 6 almanacs in 28 editions. He'll die in 1806, and on the day of his burial, his house and its contents will all be destroyed in the fire, along with his clock. Banneker will correspond with Jefferson, both transmitting a copy of his almanac for Jefferson's study, and hopefully sharing among the scholarly community at the time, and also would make an appeal to Jefferson on behalf of people of color. And Jefferson will send a simple reply thanking him for his interesting almanac, but say nothing at all about Banneker's pleas, again, on behalf of the rights of still enslaved men, women, and children. Elizabeth Freeman. So I've mentioned that there were petitions for freedom before the Civil War. There will be litigation filed after the war, and Elizabeth Freeman's case will actually be the one of the cases that would lead the Massachusetts legislature in its 1870 Constitution to ban slavery. So Elizabeth Freeman, known as Mum Bet, was born around 1740 to enslaved African parents, and she and her sister would be sold to the Ashleys when she's a very, very small child. She'll work for the Ashleys for 40 years. Her daughter, Little Bet, along with her daughter and Elizabeth's husband, will be killed in the Revolutionary War. So she is a war widow. As she's an adult woman, she's working in the house of the Ashleys, and her mistress will attempt to strike her daughter with a kitchen shovel over a dispute, and Mom will intervene. She will leave the home and refuse to return. The Ashleys will sue for her return, and at this point, Elizabeth Freeman will retain the services of Theodore Sedgwick, a well-known lawyer who agrees to take her case. The case was heard in the county court, and jury rules for the plaintiffs, again, making them the first enslaved Africans freed under Massachusetts' new constitution. And Ashley will be ordered to pay 30 shillings in costs. The case sets a precedent that would be affirmed in the state court in the Quack case, and again, ultimately lead to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. Ashley, after all of this, after suing for her return and losing, would ask her to return to work for the family for wages, but by this time she's gone to work for her lawyer, the Sedgwicks. She dies in 1729, a free woman. One of her great-grandchildren was W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous sociologist, Harvard PhD, and author of, I think, one of the finest history books. His Black Reconstruction is led the field, and again would be a mentor to people like Eric Foner today. On her tombstone, her children write, which is still viewable in the old cemetery at Stockbridge, they write, "She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She can neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere she had no superior or equal. She neither wasted time nor property. She never violated a trust nor failed to perform a duty. In every situation of domestic trial, she was the most efficient helper and the tenderest friend. Good mother, farewell." So again, a wonderful story, a marvelous heroine, live in history forever as Mum Bet. Okay, so we conclude the section on the Revolutionary War. I said that the war in the Lower South would be the most terrible for the enslaved, for the planters, for the British, and indeed for a period of time before that constitutional provision ending the slave trade. There'd be thousands of new Africans brought during that seven about year window. This is a recording of Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." We won't have time to play that. I'll include it in the materials to you. I include it here because we're typically teaching this class around the 4th of July, and it is a stirring rendition. Ossie Davis, if you don't know, Ossie Davis has now passed, but a marvelous actor, and he will read this rather lengthy speech that Frederick Douglass will give, which essentially will indict America for its celebration of freedom and liberty in a land where millions of people of African descent, men, women, and children, continue to be enslaved. So I'll include that and commend it to your listening. It is beautifully written and beautifully presented by Ossie Davis. become the symbol of the abolition society. Am I not a man and brother? And we will begin our session next week talking about the abolition movement in the North and its ultimate impact on the ending of slavery, obviously leading into the Civil War. So that concludes our lecture for today. Thank you all again for joining us, and look forward to our class 5. We'll see you again soon.